On November 11th, 1821 in Moscow, in the state apartment at the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, a boy, Fyodor, was born. His father, Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky, served there as a staff doctor, a physician who saw human suffering in its most naked form every day. The hospital stood on the outskirts, in Bozodomka, a district where the poor settled, where life flowed heavily and joylessly. Imagine Moscow in those years. This was not yet the capital as we know it. After the fire of the 12th year, the city was just beginning to be rebuilt. Everywhere, traces of the recent war, vacant lots where houses had burned down, beggars in the streets. The empire was healing the wounds after Napoleon's invasion, and the contrast between the noble mansions in the center and the wretched huts on the outskirts was striking. It was in this world that little Fedya grew up. His childhood was spent literally between two worlds. On one hand, the coziness of the family hearth. His mother, Maria Fyodorovna, came from the merchant family Nechaevs and was a kind and gentle woman. She read aloud to the children, told stories, and created that atmosphere of warmth in the house that Dostoevsky would remember with tenderness all his life. The family was large, 7 children, and in this children's throng, Fyodor was the second eldest. On the other hand, a completely different reality stretched outside the apartment windows. The courtyard of the Mariinsky Hospital, where the children played, adjoined the mortuary. The deceased were escorted past the windows. People disfigured by disease walked through the hospital corridors. Groans and weeping were heard. This was a daily reality that could not be avoided. From childhood, the little boy saw the underside of life: poverty, disease, death. This was imprinted on his soul forever. His father was a man of a completely different temperament. Mikhail Andreevich came from the clerical class, worked his way up on his own, trained as a doctor, and now desperately clung to his position. He was strict, suspicious, and quick-tempered. Discipline reigned in the house. The children were taught and brought up, but the atmosphere was tense. The father dreamed that his sons would receive an education, make something of themselves, and not remain raznochintsy, those who were between classes, without firm ground beneath their feet. Several years passed, and a change occurred in the family's life. The father acquired a small estate, Darovoye, in the Tula province. It was a tiny village, just a few yards, a small manor house, a grove, and fields. But for the children, this became a real discovery. For the first time, they saw the countryside, felt the open space, and encountered peasant life. Here, in Darovoye, Fyodor got to know another Russia. In the summer, the family left the stuffy Moscow, and a completely different life began. The boy wandered through the grove, listened to the stories of the peasants, and observed their everyday life. He saw both the beauty of Russian nature and the harshness of peasant labor, and the relationships between the landowners and the muzhiks, peasants. All of this formed a kind of mosaic that he could not yet understand, but which sank deeply into his memory. The contrast between the city and the countryside was huge. In Moscow, the hospital, the poor, diseases. In Darovoye, fields, sky, silence. But in both places, it was the same thing: suffering, unsettledness, a kind of anxiety. It was as if life itself was saturated with something heavy that one could not escape. And so, in this life that was just beginning to take shape, the first real blow occurred. His mother fell ill with consumption, then called a pectoral illness, and there was almost no cure for it. Maria Fyodorovna faded slowly, and the children saw their kind, gentle mother melting before their eyes. She died in 1837. Fyodor was only 16 years old. This was the first true confrontation with death, not somewhere far off in the hospital corridors, but right nearby, in the very heart of the family. The mother's death turned everything upside down. The house seemed deserted. the father became even gloomier, even more withdrawn. The elder brothers were preparing to leave for Petersburg. They were to be enrolled in a military college. The family began to fall apart, and 2 years later, something even more terrible happened. The father now lived in Darovoye, had retired, and was trying to manage the estate. But he was a difficult man, quick-tempered, suspicious, and harsh with the peasants. And in 1839, he was found dead. Officially, it was said that he died from an apoplectic stroke, that is, from a stroke. But there were other rumors, that he was killed by his serfs, driven to despair by his nitpicking and cruelty. We will never know this for sure. Perhaps it was simply an illness. Perhaps a tragedy silenced out of fear of scandal. But for the 18-year-old Fyodor, who was studying in Petersburg at the time, this was the second blow. He had lost both his mother and his father. He was left without his native home, without the ground on which he had grown. These two terrible events, the death of his beloved mother and the mysterious demise of his father, formed the basis of everything he later wrote. The theme of death, the theme of family, the theme of fathers and children, the theme of crime and punishment, all of this was born from the pain experienced in youth. Suffering became for him not just life experience, but a kind of key to understanding the human soul. And this pain, these losses, forever determined his view of the world. Tragic, compassionate, and piercingly sharp. In the spring of 1837, two brothers, Mikhail and Fyodor Dostoevsky, arrived in Petersburg. The city met them with cold, dampness, and gray skies. After Moscow, after cozy Darovoye, Petersburg seemed alien, strict, and somewhat official. The northern capital was built according to a ruler: straight avenues, regular squares, enormous stone buildings. Everything seemed to say, forget softness, forget domestic warmth. A different life begins here. One must understand what Petersburg was like in the 30s of the 19th century. This was the era of Nicholas I, a time of rigid discipline, drilling, and the militarization of all life. The emperor dreamed of turning Russia into a huge barracks where everything followed the statute. Education was also structured on the military model, and the Dostoevsky brothers were going to enter precisely such an educational institution, the main engineering college. Mikhail was not admitted due to health, and this was the first blow. The brothers were very close, always sharing everything equally: books, thoughts, dreams. And suddenly Fyodor was left alone. Mikhail left, and Fyodor remained in the huge city, preparing for exams. He lived in a boarding house, studied mathematics and drawing with tutors, everything that was required for admission. And during these months of loneliness, anxiety, and preparation, an encounter occurred that changed a great deal. Fyodor met Ivan Nikolaevich Shidlovsky. He was 21 years old. Dostoevsky was 16. Shidlovsky had just graduated from Kharkov University, served in the Ministry of Finance, but the main thing was that he was a poet, a romantic, a man of a completely different temperament than everyone else. Tall, eloquent, with burning eyes, he spoke of poetry, philosophy, and lofty matters in a way that was a delight to listen to. For the young Dostoevsky, who had just lost his mother and brother, this meeting was a salvation. Shidlovsky opened the world of true literature to him. They talked about Pushkin, about German romantics, Schiller, Hoffmann, about French writers, Balzac, Hugo. Shidlovsky read his poems, vague, mystical, full of longing and rapture simultaneously. Fyodor listened, absorbed, and felt that he had found a kindred spirit. In letters to his brother Mikhail, he wrote rapturously, "Acquaintance with Shidlovsky gave me so many hours of the best life." These conversations, these evenings, were a breath of fresh air before the barracks door slammed shut. Because the engineering college became precisely that, a barracks. Dostoevsky enrolled. The years began that he later recalled as torment. Imagine a young man dreaming of literature, creativity, and lofty ideas. And suddenly he finds himself in a military college where everything is based on discipline, drilling, and subordination. Reveille by signal, formation drills, uniform, bearing, commands. They were taught to draw fortifications, calculate the trajectories of projectiles, and build bridges. All of this was necessary for a military engineer, but completely alien to someone who lived for literature. They lived in barracks conditions, large bedrooms, hard bunks, no privacy. Around him were cadets who perceived all of this normally, even eagerly. Many dreamed of a career, ranks, and service. Dostoevsky was a black sheep. He did not like formation drills, marched poorly, was clumsy and withdrawn. His comrades did not understand him, considering him strange. But he had a secret life. At night, when everyone was sleeping, he read. He hid forbidden books under his pillow, Balzac's novels, Hugo's works, everything that the authorities did not approve of. He read voraciously, forgetting about sleep, about morning reveille. Literature was his salvation, his way of surviving in this barracks world. His friendship with Shidlovsky continued. Fyodor broke free when he had the chance, and they spoke again about books, about life, about the meaning of existence. Shidlovsky had a contradictory nature. At times he burned with faith, and at times he fell into despair and skepticism. These internal struggles, this battle of light and darkness within a single soul, sank deeply into Dostoevsky's memory. He would later create his heroes, Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, and they would possess something of this first friend, of his rebellious spirit. But in 1840, Shidlovsky left. The Petersburg climate undermined his health, and a personal drama also forced him to leave the capital. He returned to his homeland, Grushevka, and their friendship was interrupted. Dostoevsky was left alone, and the college became even more unbearable. The years dragged on slowly. Studies that brought no joy, service for which he had no inclination. He graduated from the college, received a rank, and was assigned to the drawing office at the engineering department. It seemed that a career had begun. But this was even worse. To sit at a desk, draw plans, and copy documents, this was torment. He saw life passing by, years being spent on something completely alien to his calling. And inside, a decision matured. A risky one, insane by the standards of that time. To leave the service, to abandon his rank, salary, and guaranteed future, and plunge into literature. Do you understand what kind of step this was? In Russia of the 30s and 40s of the 19th century, living by literary work was almost impossible. Writers were either wealthy or they served. Professional writers who lived only by the pen hardly existed. But Dostoevsky decided. He resigned, and immediately found himself in poverty. There was no money, and he had to live on something. He rented cheap corners, lived half-starved, and ran into debt. Creditors knocked on the door, demanding their money back. He borrowed from acquaintances, issued IOUs that he could not pay. This was desperate poverty, when you did not know what to buy bread with tomorrow. And in this situation, he looked for ways to earn money. Translations. That was what could provide at least some money. Dostoevsky undertook the translation of Balzac's Eugénie Grandet. This was his favorite writer, whom he had read in the college, and whom he admired. Now he was translating him, trying to preserve all the richness of the language, all the depth of the psychology. The work was difficult. He needed not just to translate, but to convey the style, the atmosphere, the very soul of the novel. The translation came out, brought him pennies, but the main thing, it gave him experience working with text, with language, with characters. Dostoevsky understood that simply translating was not his path. He needed to write his own work, But what? About what? How to find his theme, his voice. The years at the engineering college, the years in service, the years of poverty and debt, all of this was not in vain. He saw Petersburg from the inside, not the ceremonial, not the imperial one, but the other one, the city of the poor, officials, small people who lived in corners, counted kopecks, dreamed of happiness, but life crushed them, broke them, and did not allow them to rise. Here it was, the theme. Here they were, the heroes. Small people, humiliated and insulted, yet retaining a living soul, the capacity to love, dream, and suffer. Thus began his true destiny, the destiny of a writer. The barracks of the engineering college, the boredom of the drawing office, the poverty of the first years of freedom, all of this was the path to what he would write later, a difficult, painful, but the only possible path for him. In the autumn of 1844, sitting in his wretched corner on the outskirts of Petersburg, Dostoevsky began to write a novel. There was no money at all. He was in arrears for the apartment, and creditors were knocking on the door. Cold, hunger, despair. But in these conditions, as if defying everything, something extraordinary was born. The novel was about poor folk, about people just like himself, about the minor official Makar Davushkin, who lives in a corner behind screens, wears a shabby uniform coat, counts every kopeck, but in his soul there is a whole world. And about the poor girl, Varenka Dobroselova, an orphan whom life pushes to the brink of the abyss. They write letters to each other. It was a novel in letters, a very unusual form for Russian literature of that time. Dostoevsky wrote at night, sitting at his desk until dawn. Sometimes there was no money even for candles, and he had to write by the light of the moon or in the twilight. But he could not stop. The characters lived in him, spoke with his voice, suffered his pain. He put everything into the novel, his poverty, his loneliness, his understanding of how the soul of a person whom no one notices, appreciates, or loves can ache. By the spring of 1845, the novel was finished. Dostoevsky copied it out cleanly, revised it several times, and polished every phrase. On May 4th, he gave the manuscript to his acquaintance Grigorovich, a young writer who promised to show it to a publisher. Grigorovich lived with the poet Nekrasov, and that evening they began reading the manuscript. They read aloud, taking turns, and they could not tear themselves away. They read all night long, and when they finished, the courtyard was already getting light. They looked at each other, excited, stunned. It was brilliant. It was something completely new in Russian literature. Without waiting for morning, around 4 o'clock, they rushed to Dostoevsky's place. They woke him up, embraced him, and congratulated him. Nekrasov said he would take the novel for his almanac, that it would be a sensation. Dostoevsky did not believe it. There had been too many disappointments in his life, but they were serious, sincere. It was true. And then the most important thing began. Nekrasov took the manuscript to Belinsky. Vissarion Grigorievich Belinsky, the chief critic of the era, a man whose word decided the fate of books and writers. His opinion was law, and Belinsky read Poor Folk. Nekrasov later recalled that Belinsky was literally shaking with excitement. He said, "A new Gogol has appeared." He said that the author would either die very soon or go far, very far. He demanded to be immediately introduced to this young man. When Dostoevsky was brought to Belinsky, the critic greeted him like a prophet. He spoke about the novel, analyzed every detail, praised the psychological depth, social truth, and humanism. He asked, "Do you yourself understand what you have written?" Dostoevsky was overwhelmed. He left Belinsky in a state of rapture. This was the happiest moment in his life. Later, in penal servitude, he recalled this day and strengthened his spirit. On January 21st, 1846, Poor Folk was published in the Petersburg collection. The success was instantaneous. The young Dostoevsky was spoken of as the hope of Russian literature. He was invited to salons, introduced to literary celebrities, and his portraits were printed. He was only 24 years old, and he suddenly became famous. But the fame proved fragile. The next novella, The Double, was received coldly. Critics wrote that it was too drawn out, too gloomy, incomprehensible. Belinsky also cooled toward him. He said that Dostoevsky had wasted his talent on some phantasmagoria and that he should write simpler, closer to life. Dostoevsky painfully experienced this cooling. He was a sensitive, proud person. It seemed to him that he had been betrayed, unloved. And then literary squabbles and intrigues began. Turgenev wrote epigrams about him, ridiculing his conceit. Dostoevsky responded with insolence. Relationships soured with almost everyone, and at this time the illness began to manifest itself. The first epileptic seizures. He lost consciousness, fell, and convulsed. Upon waking, he felt a terrible devastation, a deep anguish. Doctors could not explain anything, nor could they help. This was a mysterious, terrible disease that haunted him throughout his life. Disappointment in literary fame, quarrels with Belinsky, illness, all of this coincided with a search for new ideas, a new meaning. And Dostoevsky found it in the Petrushevsky circle. Mikhail Vasilyevich. Petrushevsky was a young official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, an educated man, passionate about the ideas of utopian socialism. Every Friday, young men gathered at his place, writers, officials, officers. They spoke about the injustice of serfdom, the poverty of the people, and the need for change. They read forbidden books, Fourier, Saint-Simon, Proudhon. They dreamed of a future where there would be no slavery, poverty, or humiliation. Dostoevsky began to attend these meetings. He was attracted by the idea of justice, the idea of helping the oppressed, the poor people, the very ones he wrote about. The conversations were heated, the disputes passionate. They discussed how Russia could be changed, how peasants could be liberated, and how the people could be educated. At one of the meetings at Petrushevsky's, Dostoevsky read aloud Belinsky's famous letter to Gogol. This letter was forbidden. It could not be kept or distributed. Belinsky had written it in anger, accusing Gogol of betraying his ideals and becoming a defender of autocracy in the church. The letter was full of wrath, denunciation, and calls for change. Dostoevsky read this letter with enthusiasm, almost with ecstasy. He then believed in these ideas, in the necessity of change, in the belief that literature should serve the people and fight against injustice. But the time was dangerous. Revolutions of 1848 raged in Europe. Thrones fell, kings fled. Nicholas I feared that the revolution would spread to Russia. He tightened control, introduced the strictest censorship, and ordered surveillance of everyone who spoke of change. The Petrushevsky circle was already being watched. The secret police reported every meeting, every word, to the emperor. And a blow was being prepared that would overturn Dostoevsky's entire life and forever change his destiny. On April 23, 1849, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Dostoevsky returned home. He had been at a friend's, discussing literature and the fate of Russia all night. Tired, he went to bed. He dozed off. And an hour later, he was awakened. People entered the room. A saber clinked against the furniture. He opened his eyes. An officer in a blue uniform with Lieutenant Colonel epaulets stood before him. Next to him, a precinct officer with handsome sideburns and gendarmes. A soft, polite voice. Get up. The search lasted a long time. They rummaged through everything, tables, cabinets, papers, books. They found forbidden literature, books by French socialists, manuscripts, letters. They sealed everything, took everything away. Then they drove him away. A black carriage, a soldier nearby, an officer opposite. Petersburg was still sleeping. They rode through the streets toward the chain bridge to the building of the 3rd section, the secret police. On the same day, 33 more people were arrested, the entire Petrashevsky circle. They had been watched for a long time. Every meeting was known, every word recorded. An agent was introduced into the circle pretending to be one of them, inciting bold conversations, and then reporting to his superiors. The trap snapped shut. All day long, interrogations. What was said at the meetings? What books were read? Who said what? Dostoevsky was asked about Petrashevsky, about his ideas, about plans. The investigator tried to persuade him, promised forgiveness from the emperor himself if he would tell everything. Dostoevsky remained silent. He did not implicate anyone. He answered evasively, admitting only what could not be concealed. In the evening, at 11 o'clock, they were taken to the Peter and Paul fortress. This was the most terrifying place in Russia, a political prison from which few returned. Thick stone walls, dampness, cold. Solitary cells in the Alexeyevsky Ravelin, the most secret part of the fortress. The cell was small, several steps in length, 2 in width. Stone floor, vaulted ceiling, a tiny window near the ceiling with double bars. A bunk, a table, a chair, and silence. A terrible, oppressive silence. He spent 8 months in this cell. The loneliness was agonizing, seeing no one, speaking to no one, except during rare interrogations, not knowing what was happening outside, what tomorrow would bring, waiting endlessly. Time dragged on unbearably slowly. He walked around the cell, counting his steps. He thought. He recalled the past, childhood, his mother, Daravoye, literary triumphs. Everything seemed so distant, as if it belonged to another life. Fear gnawed from within. What would happen? Penal servitude, exile, death? Sometimes he was allowed to write, to ask for books. They gave him the Bible. He read it voraciously, discovering things he had not noticed before. The Gospel, the Psalter, the words comforted him, gave him hope. In this stone tomb, the Bible became the only light. The investigation proceeded. Interrogations, questions, protocols. The main accusation was reading Belinsky's letter to Gogol. This letter was considered a crime, a rebellion against the state and the church. Dostoevsky did not deny it. Yes, he had read it. He believed in those ideas then. But about a conspiracy, about plans for a coup, he knew nothing. There was none. But Nicholas I was furious. Revolutions were erupting all over Europe. Kings were losing thrones. The emperor feared that a revolt would start in Russia too. He demanded severe punishment. Let half the capital be imprisoned, but let the threads of the conspiracy be found, he said. On November 19th, the military court passed sentence. 22 people, including Dostoevsky, were sentenced to death by firing squad, for reading forbidden books, for conversations, for thoughts. Death. But the emperor decided otherwise. He personally altered the sentence, replacing execution with penal servitude and exile. But this was not announced. He devised a terrible ceremony, a mock execution. To be brought to the square, have the death sentence read, prepared for execution, and only at the last moment to announce a pardon, to frighten them, to break them, so they would remember it all their lives. On December 22nd, 1849, on a frosty morning, they were led out of the fortress. They were driven in closed sleighs across snowy Petersburg, Semyonovsky Square, a huge area surrounded by troops. In the middle, a black scaffold, posts for tying the condemned, soldiers with rifles. They were lined up. A priest brought out the cross, to kiss before death. Then the sentence was read. long, coldly, officially. Sentenced to death by firing squad. The words fell like hammer blows. 3 of them, the first ones, were tied to the posts. They put white shrouds on them, clothing for death. Soldiers stood in 3 ranks, loaded their rifles. Everything was real. Everything was for real. Dostoevsky stood in the group of the next ones. He watched his comrades bid farewell to life. He understood it would be his turn in a minute. What does a person feel when they know they will die in a minute? Dostoevsky later wrote about this. He saw every detail around him, the snow, the cupola of the church, the gleam of bayonets. Everything became unusually vivid, clear. He was bidding farewell to life. He thought about his brother, about his loved ones. He wanted to shout something final to them, but there were no words. A sack was placed over the head of one of the condemned, Grigoriev. The soldiers aimed. The drum roll began. This was the farewell to life. Counting the seconds. That was it. The end. And suddenly, another drum roll. A halt. An officer waves a handkerchief. A shout. Stop! An adjutant gallops up, a paper in his hands. A new decree is read. A pardon. The execution is replaced by penal servitude. Silence. Bewilderment. They don't believe it. Is this true, or are they being tormented? Then, realization. Alive. They will live. One of the condemned, Grigoriev, went insane right there. His mind could not bear it. Others stood stunned, unable to speak. Dostoevsky later wrote to his brother, "We, the dead, have risen." But what they experienced in those moments remained with him forever. The boundary between life and death, the last moments of existence, this changed everything. The sentence was pronounced. 4 years of penal servitude, then as a soldier. Swords were broken over their heads, a symbol of civil death. Dostoevsky, a nobleman, a writer, became a convict. The entire past was crossed out. They were returned to the fortress for a day. They were allowed to say goodbye to relatives. Brother Mikhail rushed over. They embraced, cried. Fyodor wrote a letter, the famous letter from the fortress. "My brother, I am not discouraged and have not lost heart. Life is life everywhere. We shall live, brother." Even then, he was thinking about future books, about what he would write when he returned. The next day, the stage began. Shackles on his hands and feet, iron rings, heavy chains. Enshackled, in convict clothes, he was transported across all of Russia to Siberia. Winter, frost, the endless road eastward. They were stopped at the transit point in Tobolsk. Here lived the Decembrists' wives, the very women who followed their husbands into exile 25 years ago. They came to the new convicts, brought food, warm clothes, and to each one, the gospel. Dostoevsky took the book, pressing it to his heart. He would carry this gospel through all his penal servitude, through all his life. Next was Omsk, the penal labor prison, Ostrog, a prison in the middle of the Siberian steppes. 4 years of hell that he had to go through to resurrect and become the Dostoevsky the whole world knows. On January 23rd, 1850, in the depths of winter, Dostoevsky, shackled, was brought to Omsk. Through the Tara gates, the prison cart entered the territory of the fortress. The gloomy wooden barracks of the Ostrog appeared ahead, the penal prison that would become his home for the next 4 years. One must understand what the Omsk Ostrog was like in those days. This was the most terrifying place in western Siberia, the central penal labor prison, where the most dangerous criminals from across the entire empire were brought. Murderers, robbers, bandits, runaway soldiers. Its own laws, its own hierarchy, its own cruel world reigned here. Dostoevsky was led into the barracks, a long wooden barrack with 2-story bunks along the walls. The overcrowding was unbearable, about 150 people in a room that could hold at most 50. They slept huddled together, on top of each other. There was no air, a stench from unwashed bodies, from the slop bucket, from rotting straw. The stuffiness was suffocating. In winter, they heated it so much that the heat was impossible, but the windows were boarded up, and there were no vents. In summer, swarms of flies, fleas, bedbugs, and the shackles. Iron rings on the legs, a chain between them. 10 pounds of iron, more than 4 kilograms, day and night. Sleeping in them, working in them, walking, clanging chains. The rings rubbed his legs raw. Wounds did not heal, they festered, but they could not be removed. That incurred punishment. In the morning, reveille. They were taken out to work. Penal labor, the heaviest, most meaningless, most exhausting. Dostoevsky, a man who had spent his whole life doing mental work, who had never held anything heavier than a pen, was forced to work as a laborer. Burning alabaster, that was one of the jobs. There was a furnace in a special shed. They had to light it, maintain the fire, and burn the stones. The heat was terrible. Sweat poured in streams, and the shackles were on his feet. Then the burnt alabaster had to be crushed, beaten with heavy hammers, turned into powder. His hands were unaccustomed, covered with calluses and bloody abrasions, dismantling old barges on the Irtysh riverbank, breaking wooden structures, dragging logs, loading them onto carts. In winter, frost over 30 degrees, the wind from the river cutting his face. In summer, heat, scorching sun, sand in his eyes. And always, shackles on his legs, a convoy with rifles, the shouts of the overseers, work at the brick factory, mixing clay, forming bricks, carrying them to the kilns. Monotonous, dull work that required no mind, only strength and endurance. Dostoevsky was exhausted, but tried not to show weakness. But the most terrifying thing was not the work. The most terrifying things were the people around him. The convicts. This was the people's element in its wildest, most unrestrained form. Murderers who had slaughtered entire families. Robbers who plundered on the high roads. Deserters, smugglers, arsonists. People without pity, without conscience, accustomed to violence and blood. Dostoevsky was a stranger to them. A nobleman, a master, a writer. What did he understand about their lives? A political prisoner, condemned not for a real crime, but for some ideas, words. They despised the political prisoners, considering them weaklings, soft-handed gentlemen. The hostility was constant. Taunts, mockery, humiliation. They could push him, step on his foot, or douse him with slop. In the darkness of the barracks, he could receive a blow, and no one would intervene. Threats were spoken openly. They could cut his throat at night, suffocate him, and no one would know. In penal servitude, a human life was worth nothing. Dostoevsky lived in constant tension. He could not show fear. That would be interpreted as weakness. He could not fawn. They would despise him even more. He had to maintain his dignity, but not arrogantly, a fine line on which survival depended. But gradually, he began to understand these people. He gazed into their faces, listened closely to their conversations, and observed. And he saw that many of them were not just beasts. They had their own concepts of honor, their own truth. Many ended up in penal servitude because of poverty, despair, and the injustice of life. In everyone, even the most terrible criminal, he found some human trait. There were also glimpses of genuine humanity. An old convict who once protected Dostoevsky from hooligans. A young man who shared his last piece of bread. These rare moments of kindness amid an ocean of cruelty were precious. Dostoevsky understood the main thing. The people, the Russian people, whom he had previously known only from books, from romantic notions, were something completely different. This was a terrible force, wild, unrestrained, yet possessing greatness, capacity for compassion, and a kind of deep wisdom. This penal servitude became for him a school for knowing the national soul. But there was another trial: illness. The epilepsy that had begun back in Petersburg worsened here. Seizures happened at the most unexpected moments. He fell, convulsed, and lost consciousness. The convicts looked on with fear. Many believed it was possession, devilry. Some recoiled, others laughed. There was no medical help whatsoever. Waking up after a seizure, he lay broken, devastated, unable to rise. Life in the Ostrog was arranged to break a man. Everything that could sustain the spirit was forbidden. No writing, almost nothing to read. Paper and ink were not given. They feared that political prisoners would start writing complaints, petitions, or dangerous texts. Dostoevsky had only one book left, the Gospel, the very one given to him by the Decembrists' wives in Tobolsk. He read it again and again, almost memorizing it. In this stone tomb, in the hell of the Ostrog, the Gospel became salvation. And something amazing was happening. The man who had been passionate about socialist ideas in Petersburg, who believed in restructuring the world according to rational laws, here, at the bottom of life, began to change. He understood that man is not a machine that can be remodeled according to a blueprint. Man is a mystery, an abyss, a struggle between good and evil within a single soul. Reading the Gospel revealed another path, not through revolution and violence, but through the transfiguration of the heart, through love and suffering. Christ, who himself went through agony, who was humiliated, crucified, but resurrected. This was the image that began to shine in the darkness of the Ostrog. This was a spiritual turning point. Dostoevsky later said that he was reborn in penal servitude. The old man died, the proud, self-confident one who believed in human reason. A new one was born, humble, understanding the depth of human nature, believing in God. 4 years passed. 4 years that he considered the time when he was buried alive and shut in a coffin. But he survived. He did not break. He did not become completely embittered. On the contrary, he took from this hell what became the foundation of all his future work: an understanding of the human soul, compassion for the suffering, faith in the possibility of resurrection even after the most terrible fall. On January 23, 1854, the term of penal servitude ended. On February 15th, he left the Ostrog. The shackles were removed. Ahead was soldier service, exile, a long path to freedom. But the worst was behind him. He survived. And now he knew about life and man what no one of the Russian writers knew. On January 23, 1854, Dostoevsky left the Omsk Ostrog. The shackles were removed, and he felt it was a resurrection. In his letters, he wrote exactly that: a new life, a resurrection from the dead. After 4 years in the hell of penal servitude, any life seemed like happiness. In March, he was transported in stages to Semipalatinsk, a dusty border town on the edge of the empire, in the middle of the steppes. Half city, half village, as they said. Low wooden houses, unpaved streets, dust or mud depending on the weather. Around, endless steppes, the wind driving tumbleweeds, the sun beating down mercilessly. The edge of the world. He was enlisted as a private in the 7th Siberian Line Battalion. Again a barracks, again bunks, again the soldier's routine. But now it was incomparable to the Ostrog. There he was buried alive, cut off from the world, from people. Here, service, but the opportunity to go out into the city, see ordinary people, talk, even read and write, albeit without the right to publish. The first company, where he was assigned, was housed in a wooden barracks. They slept on bunks, as in the Ostrog, but without shackles. His bunkmate, a 17-year-old guy, Nathan Katz, a simple soldier. He later recalled Dostoevsky, medium height, flat chest, shaven, sunken cheeks. His face was sickly, his gaze serious, gloomy. In the barracks, no one ever saw a full smile on his face. He spoke quietly, softly, unhurriedly. He did not talk about the past. Of his belongings, only one gospel, which he treasured as a relic. Service consumed all his time. Formation drills, guards, discipline, a regime of corporal punishment, severe demands. He had to carry out everything he was ordered to do, even if the order came from a corporal, a man with one extra white stripe on his shoulder strap. Dostoevsky tried to be precise, accurate. When meeting superiors, he stood at attention, saluted. Old soldiers used to say, "Sometimes you don't even notice Dostoevsky, and he's already stood at attention with his hand raised." But all of this could be endured. The main thing, he was alive, relatively free, and could dream of the future. Within a few months, he had mastered the soldier's trade. He wrote to his brother, "I know the service no worse than others." He was proud of this. A man who had held only a pen all his life learned to march, shoot, and stand guard. And then a man appeared in his life who changed much. Alexander Yegorovich Wrangel, a young official, appointed district prosecutor in Semipalatinsk. He came from Petersburg, educated, cultured, and fond of literature. Someone told him that Dostoevsky was serving here, the very writer, the author of Poor Folk, who had been in penal servitude. Wrangel found him, came to the barracks, and a friendship began. Wrangel invited Dostoevsky to his place, gave him books and magazines from the capital to read. They talked about literature, about Russia, about life. For Dostoevsky, cut off from the cultural world for 5 years, this was invaluable. He eagerly read everything he could get hold of. He learned what was happening in literature, who was writing what. And he himself began to write, for now without the right to publish, but he wrote, he couldn't help but write. Wrangel introduced him to local society. Semipalatinsk was small, and any new person was an event. Dostoevsky began to be invited to the homes of officers and officials. He found himself again among people of his own circle. He could talk about things other than service and guard duty. And at one of these evenings, he saw her. Maria Dmitrievna Isaeva, the wife of a minor official, a teacher. She was thin, nervous, with light hair and large eyes. Not a beauty, but there was something captivating about her, a kind of anxiety, vulnerability, as if she was always on the verge of tears or laughter. Dostoevsky was struck like lightning. He fell in love instantly, unconditionally, to the point of losing his mind. He was 33 years old, with penal servitude, a death sentence, and the entire abyss of suffering behind him. He was starved for love, for feminine affection, for simple human happiness. But she was married. Her husband, Alexander Ivanovich Isaev, was an unfortunate man. He had once graduated from university, dreamed of a career, but drank himself into ruin. He served as a teacher, scraping by on a pittance of a salary, drinking in binges. Maria Dmitrievna lived in poverty, in humiliation, with a drunken husband and a small stepson, Pasha. Her life was bleak. Dostoevsky began visiting them. He helped in any way he could, with money, connections, advice, but most importantly, he offered attention, participation. He talked with Maria Dmitrievna about books, about feelings, about life. She thawed, came to life. A closeness arose between them, at first spiritual, then increasingly deep, and the torments began. Jealousy toward her husband, even a drunkard, even a man she did not love, but who was her husband. Every time Dostoevsky left them, he imagined they were together, that she was his wife, and this tore at his soul. He wrote her letters, passionate, desperate, full of pain. She replied, cautiously, ambiguously, sometimes drawing him closer, sometimes pushing him away. In 1855, Isaev was transferred to serve in Kuznetsk, another town, several hundred versts away. The family left. Dostoevsky remained in Semipalatinsk, and correspondence began. He wrote to her almost every day. He poured out his soul, confessed his love, begged her not to forget him. She replied rarely, sparingly. And each of her letters was an event, a celebration, and torment simultaneously. And then the news came. Isaev had died. He had completely drunk himself to death, ruined his health, and passed away. Maria Dmitrievna was left a widow, without means of subsistence, with a child in her arms. Dostoevsky decided this was fate. Now he was free to ask for her hand. He wrote to her, proposed marriage, swore his love, but her answer stunned him. She hesitated. She said he was poor, that he had no future, that she was afraid of poverty. And suddenly a rival appeared, a teacher, Vergunov, a young man who courted Maria Dmitrievna. He had a job, stability. Maria Dmitrievna wrote to Dostoevsky that she did not know whom to choose. This was more terrifying than penal servitude, jealousy, despair, fear of losing her. Dostoevsky tossed and turned, writing pleading letters. The epileptic seizures became more frequent. His nerves couldn't handle it. He fell, convulsed, and upon waking, lay broken, devastated. Wrangel saw him in this state and was horrified. Dostoevsky went to Kuznetsk. He saw her, talked, and persuaded her. He told her about his plans, that he would soon be promoted to officer, his rights restored, and that he would write and publish again. He begged her to give him a chance. Maria Dmitrievna agreed. But even this consent was shadowed by doubt. She said she was marrying him because he was the only one who understood her. But did she truly love him? He did not know that. On February 6th, 1857, they were married in Kuznetsk. Dostoevsky was happy, wildly, desperately happy. He had obtained his first love, his wife. It seemed that after all the suffering, after penal servitude and loneliness, happiness had finally arrived. But the happiness was short-lived. Very quickly, it turned out that this marriage was a mistake. Maria Dmitrievna proved to be a capricious, nervous woman, eternally dissatisfied. She reproached him for his poverty, for his lack of a career. His seizures, his withdrawal, and his constant work on manuscripts irritated her. They argued, made up, but the former closeness was gone. Dostoevsky realized he had loved not a real woman, but his image, his dream of love. Reality turned out to be harsher and more bitter, but it was too late to retreat. They were bound by marriage, and this bond had to be born. In the same year, joyful news arrived. On October 1st, 1856, he was promoted to ensign, and then his noble rights were restored. He became a nobleman again, received permission to publish. 10 years of exile had ended. The path back to literature was open. Wrangel helped him break through, writing petitions and lobbying in the capital. And now, permission to return to European Russia. True, not to Petersburg, not to Moscow. Entry there was forbidden. But Tver was possible. He prepared for the journey. Behind him were years of exile, penal servitude, and soldier service. Ahead, a new life, a return to literature. But beside him was a wife who no longer brought joy, but burden. And this was the bitter beginning of a new phase of life. At the end of December 1859, Dostoevsky returned to Petersburg. 10 years had passed since the day he was taken to the Peter and Paul fortress. 10 years of penal servitude, exile, and soldier service. The city met him on a cold winter day. He walked along the familiar streets, and everything seemed alien, changed, and he himself was a different person. Brother Mikhail greeted him with joy and tears. They embraced, two people whom life had scattered, but who always remained close. Mikhail had settled in Petersburg, lived modestly, and was engaged in literary matters, translating. Now the brothers were together again, and an idea was born to them. They needed to publish a magazine, their own magazine where they could say what they thought, where their direction, their voice, would be heard. Russia of the 60s of the 19th century was seething. The abolition of serfdom, reforms, disputes about the country's paths of development. Liberals, conservatives, radicals, all clashed in a fierce struggle of ideas. Journalism was the main battlefield, and the Dostoevsky brothers decided to enter this struggle. The entire year of 1860 was spent on preparation. Mikhail lobbied for permission, raised money, and sought a printing house. Fyodor wrote the magazine's program, invited authors, and formed the editorial circle. In September, they sent out an announcement for subscriptions to the magazine Vremya, Time, for the year 1861. The magazine's program was called Poshvenichestvo, Back to the Soil Movement. This was their own philosophy, developed by Dostoevsky after penal servitude. Its essence was this: Russia had split. The reforms of Peter I divided educated society and the common people. Noblemen spoke French, read European books, and lived by Western ideas. But the people remained with their faith, their traditions, their way of life. Two worlds in one country, and they did not understand each other. What was to be done? Westernizers said, "We must go further along the European path, adopt Western orders and civilization." Slavophiles objected, "We must return to antiquity, to Russian roots, reject Western influence." Dostoevsky proposed a third way. We must return to the pochva, soil, to the people's foundations, to national principles, but not rejecting the achievements of European culture, rather combining them with the national spirit. Educated society needed to merge with the people, understand them, and accept their truth. These ideas formed the basis of the magazine Vremya. The first issue appeared in January 1861, and immediately the publication of Dostoevsky's novel The Insulted and Humiliated began. A story about poor folk, about suffering, about love and self-sacrifice. The public read ravenously. They remembered poor folk and expected exactly this from Dostoevsky: compassion for the small man, deep psychological insight. And the following year, notes from the House of the Dead began to be printed in the magazine. This was a confession about penal servitude, the first truthful description of life in the Ostrog and Russian literature. Dostoevsky wrote about the convicts, about their characters, their crimes, and their suffering. He showed the people from the inside, terrible, cruel, yet alive, genuine. It was a revelation. The success was enormous. The magazine began to grow. In the first year, the number of subscribers reached 4,000, the same as Otechestvenie Zapiski, Fatherland Notes, and Ruskoye Slovo, Russian Word. Only Nekrasov's Sovremennik, the Contemporary, and Katkov's Ruski Vestnik, Russian Messenger, were ahead. But Vremya was confidently in the first ranks of Russian journalism. A circle formed around the magazine. The critic Apollon Grigoriev, the philosopher Nikolai Strakov, the publicist Alexei Razin. They gathered in the editorial office, argued, discussed articles and plans. Fyodor Mikhailovich was the soul of this circle. He walked around the room in short steps, clicked his tongue, and suddenly began to speak, and everyone fell silent, listening. He was a prophet, a teacher, an inspirer. But the magazine work consumed all his strength. He had to write articles, edit others' texts, engage in polemics with other publications, and monitor censorship. Dostoevsky worked to the point of exhaustion. In addition, the epileptic seizures continued, and his health deteriorated. Doctors advised him to go abroad for treatment, to take the waters. In the summer of 1862, Dostoevsky traveled to Europe for the first time. Germany, France, Switzerland, Italy, England. He saw European civilization with his own eyes and was disappointed. Paris seemed to him a city of lies and debauchery. London, the capital of bourgeois vulgarity and poverty. Everywhere, a chase for money, philistinism, unbelief. Europe is dying, he thought. The future belongs to Russia, to its spiritual foundations. But there was another side to this trip. In Paris, he became closer to a young woman he had seen earlier in Petersburg. Apollinaria Suslova, a student, emancipated, bold, passionate. She was 22 years old. He was 40. She became fascinated with him. He flared up. Correspondence and meetings began. The following year, in the summer of 1863, they met in Paris. It was supposed to be passion, romance, happiness. But Suslova had managed to fall in love with someone else, a Spanish student. Dostoevsky arrived, and she announced that she loved another. This was a blow. Humiliation, pain, jealousy. And the wanderings across Europe began, together, but already as friends, as travel companions. They traveled through Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. The relationship was agonizing. She was capricious, reproachful, sometimes approaching, sometimes pushing him away. He suffered, humbled himself, could not leave. This was a painful dependence, and to top it all off, he started playing roulette. In Wiesbaden, Bad Homburg, everywhere there were casinos. He sat down at the table, placed bets on red or black, and couldn't tear himself away. He won, lost, won again. The gambling fever gripped him so much that he forgot everything. He lost his last money, pawned his watch, his clothes. He starved, lived in cheap hotels. He wrote pleading letters to Suslova, send money. She sent it. He lost it again. This was a fall. A man who had survived penal servitude, whose spirit had risen, who preached lofty ideas, and suddenly this shameful dependence on cards, on a capricious woman, on his own passions. But perhaps he needed to go through this too, to fully understand the nature of human passions, weaknesses, and falls. All of this would later enter his novels, The Gambler Alexei Ivanovich, The Suffering Heroes, the agonizing relationships between men and women. Returning to Petersburg in the autumn, he learned terrible news. The magazine Vremya was closed. In the April issue of 1863, Strakov's article on the Polish uprising was published. The article was cautious, but the censorship perceived sympathy for the Poles in it, an insufficiently patriotic tone. A report was made to the emperor. Alexander II ordered the closure of the magazine. This was a blow for the brothers. The magazine brought income, provided means of subsistence. A circle of authors and subscribers had formed around it, and suddenly everything collapsed. Mikhail was in despair. Fyodor too. They began lobbying for permission for a new magazine. They lobbied for a year, and in 1864, they received permission for the magazine Epoka, Epoch. But they failed to repeat the success of Vremya. Subscribers were fewer, and debts grew. And then something even more terrible happened. On July 10th, 1864, his brother Mikhail died, suddenly from liver disease. Fyodor was left alone, without his closest person, without a friend, without an associate, and all the debts of the magazine, all the worries about his brother's family, fell upon his shoulders. This was the beginning of a new period of life, a period of debts, poverty, and a desperate struggle for existence, but also the period when he would write his greatest novels. Suffering again became his lot, and again it would give birth to great literature. The year 1864 began with his wife's illness. Maria Dmitrievna was dying of consumption, slowly, painfully, heavily. Dostoevsky moved her from Petersburg, first to Vladimir, then to Moscow. He hoped that the change of climate would help, that she would pull through. But the doctors only shook their heads. She wasted away like a matchstick. Her chest rattled, her cough tore at her. Her character became unbearable, irritable, capricious, demanding constant attention. She could not bear to see anyone, not even her own son Pasha, only her husband. And Dostoevsky sat beside her, trying to work, but the thought hammered in his head. She is dying, dying, dying. On April 14th, a seizure occurred. Blood streamed from her throat, starting to flood her chest. She choked, thrashed, trying to breathe. Dostoevsky rushed about, calling doctors, but nothing could be done to help. On April 15th, toward evening, she died. Quietly, fully conscious. She managed to bless everyone. Dostoevsky sat by her bedside and wept. He loved her, with a strange, agonizing love. They were not happy together. They argued, irritated each other, lived apart, but they couldn't separate. The unhappier they were, the stronger they clung to each other. And now she was dead, and a void formed in his life that nothing could fill. He rushed to Petersburg, to his brother Mikhail, the only close person he had left. They needed to stick together, support each other. The magazine Epocha was published with difficulty. Few subscribers, growing debts, not enough money. But at least there was work, at least there was meaning. And suddenly, a new blow. On July 10th, 3 months after his wife's death, Mikhail died. He fell ill with a liver condition, lingering for only a month. Doctors said, "Nothing serious, it will pass." And then, in 3 days, a crisis, death. Unexpectedly, absurdly, terrifyingly. Dostoevsky could not believe it. His brother, the closest person, childhood friend, magazine associate, dead. He was left alone. Completely alone. At 43 years old, without a wife, without a brother, without a family. At the funeral, he stood as if in a fog. Then he came home and realized everything rested on his shoulders. The magazine's debts, enormous, several thousand rubles. His brother's family, a widow with children whom he had to support. His stepson Pasha, Maria Dmitrievna's son, also in his care. Creditors knocked on the door, demanding money. IOUs, promissory notes, interest. He could have refused the debts. Legally, they belonged to his brother, not him. But Dostoevsky said, "I will pay everything. This is a debt of honor. My brother worked for the magazine, invested effort and money. Now I am responsible." Penal servitude began, not the Omsk kind, with shackles, but no less difficult. Penal servitude of debts, poverty, endless work. He had to write, to earn money, to pay the creditors, to feed his brother's family and himself. The magazine Epocha lasted a few more months and then closed. There was no money. Subscribers had scattered. The last issue came out in February 1865. Dostoevsky was left with a pile of debts and no source of income. Creditors pressed hard. They came, demanded, threatened. By the law of that time, he could be imprisoned in a debtor's prison for debts. Dostoevsky lived in fear. Every knock on the door, was it the bailiff? Was it arrest? He borrowed from acquaintances, issued new promissory notes with interest. He paid old debts with new ones. He spun like a squirrel in a wheel. He wrote to editors, asking for advances for future novels. He received pennies, and they immediately went to creditors, and he made a decision to flee abroad. Creditors couldn't reach him there. He could work calmly there, write a major novel, get money, and settle with everyone. In the summer of 1865, he left. Germany, Wiesbaden, a resort town with a casino. He rented a cheap room in a hotel, sat down to write the novel Crime and Punishment, and started playing roulette. This was a sickness. He knew it was madness, that he shouldn't, that he would lose. But he couldn't stop. He sat down at the table, placed bets on red or black. He won, and immediately bet again. He lost, borrowed money, and went back to the table. The idea in his head was hit the jackpot, solve all financial problems at once, win enough to pay off debts, publish his collected works, and provide for his brother's family, to escape poverty with one strike. But roulette is merciless. He lost, again and again. His last money, his last pennies. He pawned his watch, signet ring, and clothes. He lived on bread and tea. He didn't pay for his room at the hotel. The owners threatened to throw him out. He wrote humiliating letters to acquaintances. "Send money. I beg you. I am in a desperate situation." He asked the writer Turgenev, who sent a small amount, but with contempt. Dostoevsky felt this contempt and choked with shame. In this hell, in this poverty and humiliation, he wrote Crime and Punishment. A novel about the student Raskolnikov, who kills the old pawnbroker because he has no money, because life crushes him, because he wants to check, does he have the right? Dostoevsky wrote from his own pain, from his own despair. He worked at night, by candlelight. During the day, roulette, humiliations, hunger. At night, the novel, the heroes, suffering, redemption. Raskolnikov walked the streets of Petersburg, tormented himself, suffered, searched for a way out. Dostoevsky walked together with him, through his own circle of hell. The editor Katkov agreed to print the novel in the magazine Ruski Vestnik, Russian Messenger. He sent in advance. Dostoevsky lost it. He asked for more, received it, and lost it again. Katkov waited for the chapters of the novel, rushing him. Dostoevsky wrote at a frantic pace, sent them off, and went back to the roulette wheel. This was a struggle with himself, with his weakness, his passion, his fall. Raskolnikov killed and tormented himself. Dostoevsky ruined himself with roulette and tormented himself. Both stories ran parallel, the literary and the real. By autumn, he returned to Petersburg, a ruined gambler, impoverished, sick. Epileptic seizures became more frequent. His health was undermined, debts were even greater. But the novel was written. The first chapters were published. Readers were delighted. Crime and Punishment became a sensation. Everyone talked about Raskolnikov, about Sonia Marmeladova, about the terrible psychology of crime and redemption. Dostoevsky had returned to great literature. But at what cost? Through what hell? He was at the bottom. But it was precisely from this bottom that he would rise. A year later, he would meet the woman who would save him. He would write his greatest novels. He would become a prophet for Russia. But for now, this was a debtor's prison from which there was no visible escape, and only work, only creativity kept him afloat. Autumn of 1866. Dostoevsky was in a desperate situation. He had concluded a bondage contract with the publisher Stelovsky. He had to submit a new novel by November 1st, otherwise Stelovsky would gain the right to publish everything Dostoevsky wrote for 9 years without any fee. This was a trap. Stelovsky hoped the writer would fail to meet the deadline and would thus gain ownership over his work. Dostoevsky was working on Crime and Punishment, sending chapters to Ruski Vestnik. There was no time for a second novel. Friends advised him, hire a stenographer, dictate. It will be faster. Dostoevsky agreed. He contacted a stenographer's office. They sent a young girl. On October 8th, the doorbell rang. A 20-year-old girl entered, fair-haired, pretty, modestly dressed. She introduced herself, Anna Grigorievna Snitkina. She had graduated from Olkin's shorthand courses and had come to work. She carried herself seriously, businesslike. She was not timid before the famous writer, but spoke respectfully. Dostoevsky explained the task. A novel needed to be written in a month. I will dictate in the evenings, about 3 or 4 hours. You will record in shorthand, transcribe it at home, and bring the typed copy in the morning. Can you do it? Anna nodded. I can. They began working. The novel was called The Gambler, about a young man obsessed with the passion for roulette. Dostoevsky dictated, walked around the room, gestured, and entered the role. Anna sat, bent over her notebook, recording quickly. She did not ask questions, did not interrupt. She worked clearly, professionally. But with each passing day, Dostoevsky looked closer at her, intelligent, tactful, kind. She laughed at his jokes, understood him immediately. She asked about the characters, was interested in the plot, not just a stenographer, a conversationalist. In 26 days, the novel was written. On October 30th, Anna brought the final chapters. They succeeded. Dostoevsky was happy. Stilovsky would not gain control over him. He thanked Anna, saying she had saved him. The work was finished, but Dostoevsky continued to invite Anna to visit. "Come by," he said, "just to talk." Anna came. They drank tea, conversed. He spoke about penal servitude, about his plans, about literature. She listened, admired. Gradually he understood. He was in love. But he was 45 years old. She was 20. A quarter of a century difference. He was sick with epilepsy, indebted to the whole world, a former convict. She was young, from a decent family, with her whole life ahead of her. What right did he have? On November 8th, he made up his mind. He called Anna and began to tell the plot of a new novel. An artist, elderly, sick, having suffered much. He meets a girl. The girl's name is Anya, a good name. The artist falls in love, but he knows he is unworthy. Still, he decides to propose. His voice trembled. Anna sat, not understanding where he was leading. And then Dostoevsky looked into her eyes and asked, "Imagine that this artist is me, that I have confessed my love to you and asked you to be my wife. What would you say?" Silence. Anna understood. This was not a novel. This was a proposal. She looked at his tormented, agitated face, and her heart contracted. She answered simply, "I would tell you that I love you and will love you all my life." He embraced her, crying from happiness. He said, "God gave you to me." She stroked his head, comforted him. She knew that the future would be difficult, but she loved him, not passionately, but deeply, compassionately, faithfully. She wanted to care for him, cherish him, help him. On February 15th, 1867, they were married in the Trinity Cathedral. A modest wedding, few guests. Dostoevsky's relatives met Anna coldly. His stepson Pasha was rude. Brother Mikhail's family demanded money, reproaching them. Everyone looked at the young wife as a stranger. Anna understood. Survival here was impossible. Creditors were knocking. Relatives were nagging. The atmosphere was unbearable. She suggested, "Let's go abroad. For a few months, say. For treatment." But in reality, to escape the creditors, the relatives, and all this nightmare. Dostoevsky agreed. They left in April, first to Germany, then Switzerland, Italy. They thought it would be for 3 months. They stayed for 4 years. Wanderings through Europe, cheap hotels, perpetual lack of money. Dostoevsky wrote novels, sending chapters to Russia. Editors sent fees, crumbs that were not enough. And the most terrible thing began. Roulette. In Baden, Hamburg, Saxon-les-Bains, everywhere there were casinos. Dostoevsky could not pass them by. He sat down at the table, placed a bet, and lost. Everything down to the last kopeck. Anna gave him her last money, knowing he would lose. And he lost. He came home broken, cried, asked for forgiveness. He swore he would never play again. Anna forgave him, comforted him. A day later, he went back to the table. This was a sickness, a passion he could not fight. Anna understood. She had to endure. This was part of his nature, like epilepsy. It couldn't be cured. It could only be lived through. She ran the household, counting every penny. She wrote down all expenses in a notebook: bread, milk, candles. She pawned her dress, her wedding ring. She bought them back when money came. She pawned them again. They lived in poverty, but she did not complain. She wrote letters to publishers, wrangled advances, conducted negotiations. She became his secretary, accountant, agent, and Dostoevsky wrote, "In these agonizing conditions, in poverty, between breakdowns at the casino, he created The Idiot, a novel about Prince Mishkin, a positively beautiful man who tries to live by the laws of goodness and love in a world of evil and passion." Anna transcribed the manuscript, sent it to Russia. Money arrived late, instantly dispersed. In February 1868, their daughter was born. They named her Sofia, Sonia. Dostoevsky was happy. Fatherhood at 47 years old, a miracle. He played with the little girl, told her fairy tales, adored her. Anna looked at them and thought, this is true happiness, but happiness proved fragile. In May, Sonia fell ill, pneumonia. Doctors treated her, but the child faded. On May 24th, the girl was only 3 months old. She died. In her mother's arms, quietly, as if she had fallen asleep. Dostoevsky was crushed. He sobbed like a child. Anna remained outwardly calm, but something broke inside. The first child, so desired, and suddenly death. They buried Sonia in a small cemetery in Geneva. They stood by the grave, holding hands. Grief brought them even closer. Anna understood. They had to live on. She had to support her husband, work, run the household. She was young, 22 years old, but she had already gone through so much that others do not experience in a lifetime. Roulette, poverty, the death of a child. And through all of this, she remained faithful, patient, loving. Dostoevsky increasingly understood she was his salvation. Without her, he would have perished, drowned in debts, consumed by passions, driven insane. She kept him afloat, quietly, imperceptibly, but firmly. And he thanked God for this woman whom he had sent him in the darkest hour of his life. The story of the creation of demons, the possessed, began not in Russia, but abroad, during those difficult, impoverished years when Dostoevsky and Anna lived between Dresden, Geneva, Florence, and Baden. He worked exhaustively, wrote at night, and searched for a new concept. Anxiety was felt everywhere. Europe was seething, revolutionary sentiments were growing, youth dreamed of upheavals, and secret societies were beginning in Russia. In the autumn of 1869, the world was shaken by the news. A murder had occurred in Moscow. The student Ivanov was stabbed by members of the secret society People's Retribution, led by Sergei Nechayev. This murder was committed in the name of an idea, in the name of revolution. The maniacal belief in the end justifying the means shocked Dostoevsky. He wrote to his brother, "Russian demons have broken loose into the light." It was then that the idea for a novel was born, one that would show how a demonic force takes possession of people's minds when a person, believing in false freedom, loses his soul. Dostoevsky wrote Demons in Dresden in the winter of 1870. He understood. He was writing not just a novel about crime, but a parable about how an entire generation loses faith. His characters are not people, but those obsessed with ideas. He created archetypes. Stavrogin, a proud man who lost his spiritual root. Verkhovensky, a fanatic ready to subjugate others. Shatov and Kirillov, sufferers searching for truth but moving in opposite directions. Through them, Dostoevsky investigated the terrible question, what will happen to Russia if faith leaves people's hearts? In letters to friends, he wrote that the novel would be disturbing, painful, but necessary. Russia is possessed by demons, and I must name them. He felt himself not merely a writer, but a witness of the era, obligated to tell the truth. The novel was written long and agonizingly, with interruptions and bouts of illness. Anna helped. She transcribed manuscripts, corresponded with publishers, and saved every kopeck. She patiently endured everything: outbursts of irritation, oppressive periods of depression, breakdowns. But she saw that great work was happening in him, and she did not interfere. More than anything else during these years, Dostoevsky realized that she was his true ally and savior. In 1871, their daughter Lyubov was born. The little girl was frail and sickly, but she brought joy. Dostoevsky began to play with her, put down his pen to hear her laugh. For the first time in many years, he felt family happiness, quiet and real, and Anna insisted. It was time to go home. She felt that her husband longed for his homeland, for the Russian word, for his people. And in the spring of 1871, the Dostoevsky family returned to Russia, poor but free. 4 years of emigration were behind them. Petersburg greeted them with the same gray sky and icy wind, but now it was native air. With their return to Russia, a new page in their life began. In his homeland, the publication of Demons in the magazine Ruski Vestnik awaited him. The novel was published in parts in 1871-72 and immediately caused a storm. Readers were stunned. It was a cry from the soul, a prophetic novel about the abyss into which a person can fall when he rejects God. For others, it was a masterpiece, a revelation. For the liberal critics, it was a pamphlet against the young generation, an attempt to discredit revolutionaries. Liberal criticism attacked Dostoevsky with fury. He was accused of obscurantism, of betraying free ideas. He was silent, because he knew time would set everything right. Demons was a prophecy. He showed how evil is born from the dream of good, how the belief in restructuring the world without God turns a person into a destroyer. Many did not understand, but decades later, Russia would remember this novel and say, yes, he saw further than everyone else. After Demons, life changed. The novel's success brought not only fame, but also money. For the first time in many years, the Dostoevskys climbed out of debt. Anna showed a surprising gift for administration. She organized the publication of his collected works herself, kept the accounts, saved the fees, established relations with printing houses, and wrangled favorable contracts. Fyodor Mikhailovich now entrusted her with everything: letters, finances, plans. He could write calmly, without worrying about daily bread. Anna held everything together. During this period, Dostoevsky completely gave up roulette. He swore to his wife that he would never gamble again, and he kept his word. Work, responsibility, and faith replaced the game. He learned to control his passions. Anna said that she no longer saw the tormented gambler before her, but a mature husband and father, confident and calm. The family grew during these years. In 1872, their son Fyodor was born, and in 1874, Alexei. The family lived modestly, but happily. Dostoevsky spent evenings with the children, read them fairy tales, drew, and played the piano. After so many storms and catastrophes, he felt domestic peace for the first time. In letters, he wrote to friends, "My happiness is in my family. Everything else is secondary." Now he could look back on the past years, penal servitude, poverty, illnesses, suffering, and understand. All of it was necessary to reach this quiet haven. The novel Demons became for him not only a literary triumph, but also a spiritual turning point. He was purified from doubts, from dependencies, from former passions. He returned to faith, to Russia, to himself. His literature henceforth became not just art, it became a service. And next to him, Anna, always, invariably. She protected the home, and his strength, and his memory, and his word. With her light, imperceptible hand, began the era when Dostoevsky turned not just into a writer, but into a prophet of his people. And in this is her merit, her quiet, feminine miracle. In the early 70s of the 19th century, Russia lived anxiously. Popular unrest, reform after reform, faith was shaken, convictions scattered. Dostoevsky saw all this and said with pain, "We have lost our spiritual roots." After Demons, he felt that his task now was not just to write novels, but to speak directly to people, not as an artist, but as a person who loves and suffers for his people. Thus was born the concept of a new endeavor, a writer's diary. At first, it was merely a column in the magazine Grazdanin, The Citizen, of which Dostoevsky became the chief editor in 1873. He decided to create a special section in this magazine, a magazine within a magazine, where he would write about everything that concerned him, the fate of Russia, faith, the people, children, conscience, truth. The first issue with the inscription, A Writer's Diary, appeared on January 1st, 1873. And from the first lines, a new tone was visible, live, confessional, frank, fictional. This was not a publicist, not a moralist. This was a person talking to a person. Dostoevsky wrote about everything, the secrets of the human soul, the Russian idea, poverty and injustice, Europe, religion, art. He could discuss the suicide of a young girl in one article and the meaning of suffering in the next. Separate texts were real stories: the heavenly Christmas tree, a gentle creature, the dream of a ridiculous man. In them, the pain for the little man was felt, for all those whom life had crushed and who did not know where to seek light. Gradually, Dostoevsky realized that the confines of someone else's publication were too narrow for him. In 1875, he received permission to publish a writer's diary as his own monthly magazine. This was unheard of, a magazine by one author. No one before him had the audacity to run a publication where everything, from the leading article to the last page, was written by a single hand. He wrote articles, feuilletons, stories, published readers' letters, and answered them himself. In the years 1876 and 1877, A Writer's Diary became a genuine cultural event. It was awaited in every reading family. There were thousands of subscribers, officials, teachers, priests, students. Newspapers argued, reprinted excerpts, and the public was inflamed and admired. People wrote letters to Dostoevsky from all over the country, from provincial teachers, from poor widows, from exiles, even from school children. He replied. He became not just a writer, a mentor, a conversationalist, a spiritual physician, but behind the external success lay personal trials. In 1875, his youngest son Alexei, a 3-year-old boy, cheerful, lively, resembling his father, died of a chest disease. The illness began suddenly, epilepsy, the same that tormented Dostoevsky. The father did not leave the bedside, holding his son's hand during seizures. When the boy died, Fyodor Mikhailovich collapsed onto the floor and wept like a child. Anna, steeling her heart, took her husband to Optinapustin. There, in the monastery, they met Elder Ambrose, a famous confessor, far-sighted, gentle, and profoundly spiritual man. The conversation with the elder became a turning point for Dostoevsky. He later said that he felt spiritual relief, as if a heavy stone had been lifted. He prayed for our boy, Anna wrote, and spoke of eternal love that overcomes death. After this, Dostoevsky returned to Petersburg, seemingly a different, purified man. He took up work again, now on the novel that was meant to be the pinnacle of his creation. Thus appeared the Brothers Karamazov. In this book, he wanted to say everything that had accumulated: doubt and faith, fathers and children, crime and mercy, love and rebellion, everything he had ever experienced, everything that tormented his soul. The novel became the summation of his whole life and the answer to the main question: Is it possible to live without God if the world is full of suffering? Dostoevsky did not just write the novel, he lived it as a confession. Parts of the Brothers Karamazov were published in Ruski Vestnik, and each issue became an event. At the same time, he continued to publish a writer's diary. Interest only grew with each new publication. His words were discussed, quoted, and debated at meetings and in drawing rooms. Some called him a fanatic, others, a saint. He became a figure of national scale, the voice of Russia that spoke to the conscience of an entire people. And in June 1880, Dostoevsky experienced the peak of his fame. He was invited to the solemn unveiling of the Pushkin Monument in Moscow. Crowds of people, poets, professors, students, gymnasium pupils, political figures. He ascended the tribune, thin, pale, with eyes that burned with inner light. The hall fell silent. He unfolded a sheet of paper and began, not reading, but as if speaking from the heart. His speech about Pushkin lasted less than an hour, but all of Russia resonated within it. He said that Pushkin was the ideal Russian man, the embodiment of Vysedinstvo, all unity, combining the West and the East, faith and reason, the people and the intelligentsia. That through Pushkin, Russia was capable of understanding and reconciling the whole world. People wept. The crowd jumped up, applauded, and shouted. Everyone rushed toward him, lifted him up, and called him a prophet. Leo Tolstoy later said, "Only he had such power over the hearts of the people." After that speech, he began to be called the teacher of the nation. His words sounded like the word of a spiritual leader. Not only readers wrote to him, but also priests, officers, women, mothers, and peasants. He became what destiny had led him to be all his life, a prophet speaking of faith, suffering, and love. And when he was asked why he wrote, he answered simply, "To warm a person's heart, if only a little." A writer's diary became not just a book. It was a living connection between the writer and his people. On these pages, he lived through the pains of others, trying to answer them. And the people responded. Thus, 10 years after Demons, through penal servitude, poverty, illness, and the death of a son, Dostoevsky achieved nationwide fame. Not as a star, not as a hero, but as a man who was trusted. And this was fame equal to love. In the autumn of 1880, Fyodor Mikhailovich already felt that his health was weakening. Pulmonary emphysema was complicated by hemorrhages, shortness of breath increased, and his voice became hoarse. But he was still working, finishing the last issues of a writer's diary. It seemed he had some inner urgency, as if he sensed little time remained. Despite all his exhaustion, he refused to rest. Later, he told Anna. Now I need to say the last word to the people. During these months, he was especially inspired, as if summing up his entire life. In a writer's diary, he wrote about Russia, children, faith, and God, in simple, almost paternal words. He mentioned death more and more often, but not as a fear, as a return. He told Anna, "I feel that I will die soon, and only one thing is frightening. I won't manage to say everything." In December 1880, after the Pushkin speech and the publication of the Brothers Karamazov, the stream of letters and visits became endless. People came to see him as if he were a saint, priests, students, mothers with children. Dostoevsky received everyone, tired, pale, but benevolent. There was not a shadow of arrogance in him, only fatigue and a desire to help with a word. In winter, the illness worsened. Pulmonary hemorrhages opened up more and more often. The doctor advised rest, bed rest, and complete silence. But he did not listen. He continued to write, dictated letters to Anna, and planned the new issue of the diary. She begged him to stop. He replied, "If I fall silent, I won't make it." On January 25th, 1881, An argument occurred in the house with his sister, Vera Mikhailovna. The reason was minor, a dispute over an inheritance from a deceased relative. Dostoevsky, exhausted and nervous, flared up. Then he fell silent, left angrily. His heart beat heavily. That night, he felt ill. In the morning, January 26th, bleeding from the lungs began. He sat on the sofa, pale as wax, clutching his chest. Anna rushed over. He only said, "Now, the end." Doctors were called. They stopped the blood, but warned a new hemorrhage would be fatal. That day, he wrote the last letter to his son Fyodor. "Look after your mother and brother. Remember that without her, you will perish." Then he asked for the gospel, the very book he had carried through penal servitude. He opened it at a random page and read, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father." He closed the book and quietly said, "There, that's everything." On January 27th, he barely spoke, breathed heavily, and sometimes lost consciousness. Only once did he tell Anna, "I loved you more than I could say." In the evening, he called the children, Fedya and Lyubov. He stroked their hair, crossed them, and whispered, "Take care of Mama." On January 28th, at 8 hours and 38 minutes in the evening, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky died. He died peacefully, without agony, with a slight smile, as if he had fallen asleep. On Anna's lap lay the open book, the Gospel. News of his death spread instantly. Petersburg seemed to freeze. Newspapers came out with mourning borders, and people on the street spoke only of him. According to various estimates, between 20,000 and 30,000 people came to bid farewell to the writer. The funeral turned into a national demonstration of love. The procession could not be stopped. Students, workers, soldiers, townsfolk, priests walked shoulder to shoulder. They carried wreaths, icons, portraits. People wept and sang psalms. From Nikolaevskaya Street to the Tikhvin Cemetery of the Alexander Nevsky Lavra, the road was covered with flowers. He was buried next to Glinka and Nekrasov. On the white stone were engraved the words that he himself had once chosen from the Gospel. "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." These words became a symbol of his life. Everything he went through, suffering, penal servitude, humiliation, illness, was not in vain. From that pain grew great literature that gave hope to millions of people. Thus ended the path of the man who sought and affirmed one thing all his life, that a spark of divine light lives in every heart, and in this light immortality,